So tonight our panelists were joined by Jennifer Rushlow, who's the director of the Environmental Law Center at Vermont Law School and the Dean of Environmental Programs. We have Lauren Oates, who is the Climate and Energy Policy Manager at the Nature Conservancy, and Steve Crowley, who's a volunteer leader with the Sierra Club and the Energy Chair. So thanks so much, everyone, for being here, and I will turn it over to Steve.
So I'm Steve Crowley. What I'm going to do tonight is provide a brief overview of what this Global Warming Solutions Act actually is, what it contains, and then we'll get on to our discussion. So let me start by sharing a few slides. All right. So Global Warming Solutions Act. This, as probably most of you have joined us know, this is partway through the legislative process. It was passed overwhelmingly by both the House and Senate. It's still got to get concurrence from a couple of small amendments, but then it's off to the governor's desk. And hopefully he will sign it. If he doesn't, I feel confident that the legislature has already passed this with a 2/3 majority in both houses, and so I believe that they would go ahead and override. So we'll see how that goes. But let me give you a brief overview of what's actually contained in the bill, how it's structured and what it's supposed to do. So first of all, when it first got introduced, it was pretty bare bones. The idea behind it was to set some actual targets, take existing targets the state had put in place at different times and put them into law as accountable goals. And what those included was, although it's more of a finding than an actual goal, it's based on achieving no more than 2 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature based on the IPCC and Paris Agreement and all that. And to achieve that, the science tells us we would need to get 26%, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions 26% below 1990 by 2025, 40% by below 2005 by 2030, and 80 below 2005 by 2050. Those are goals that were adopted at different times in our history, some in law, some in the Comprehensive Energy Plan. And so that's where the different base years come from. But if you work it out to current tonnage that's we put in the air, it works out to be a fairly decent gradual decline based on the Vermont greenhouse gas inventory. For those of you who are following the science on this, you'll recognize that the science has pretty much shown that that's not good enough. But it's passable in Vermont. It was having those goals already established. It was doable. I think most of the people who follow this recognize that 2 degrees is way too hot for the planet to thrive, and these numbers will barely get us to that, or if we're really lucky, they'll get us there. The basic bare bones concept at first was just with those goals, the whole idea was handed off to the Agency of Natural Resources to write rules. And beyond that, right from the start, there was this idea of enforcement. If the rules didn't get written, or if they weren't going to get us to the required reductions, then there's an opportunity for citizen suits, for citizens, for anyone to have access to bring a lawsuit to force the issue. It's often been said by some people that this would be the environmentalists suing the state. I suppose that could happen, but I also need to point out it could be people who don't want this stuff to happen who could also do enforcement actions. So we'll see where that goes. Later, as the legislature worked on it closely, they decided there needed to be something more clear worked out as a handoff to ANR or other agencies. And so the legislature decided that they would include a climate council that would develop a climate action plan, and then the rules would flow out of that. To me, this is a really vast improvement, and it recognizes that what we're talking about is really a 30-year plan. And how do we stay on top of things? How do we look at what's going on and respond in effective ways on a periodic basis to keep evolving this plan between now and 2050. The Climate Council itself, I think, is a great opportunity for Vermont. It recognizes that this is a problem that really reaches into every corner of our world in Vermont. So there's this 22+ member council. Each of the seats are listed in the bill, which I recommend people looking through. They're appointed by the governor, or in terms of his agency heads, and the Senate and the House leadership appoint people. There are a few designated subcommittees that kind of reflect what's in the bill is a long list of details about what needs to be, what the council should pay attention to, what the action plan should include, and what the rules should accomplish. The mitigation, cross-sector mitigation subcommittee is really the traditional aspects of climate change that we've talked about over the years. How do we reduce greenhouse gas emission? I think that's the subcommittee that focuses mostly on how we achieve those goals. The others are more about what I would think of in the world of adaptation, resilience. What's the world going to look like in the future as our planet warms? We'll spend a lot of time tonight on just transition. Rural resilience is really well spelled out in the bill, and ag and ecosystems. How do Vermont's natural systems play an important role? As I said, the Climate Action Plan has a ton of details built into it. The rules are that, there will probably be rules written by ANR. There will probably be rules that come from other agencies. There will probably be recommendations for further legislation, for money, for who knows if there will be fees involved, but that's a later thing, additional rulemaking authority. So who knows where it all goes. The process takes about a little over a year for the Climate Council to form and then to write its plan, another year for the rules to get implemented. So it's going to take a while before this actually starts to have an effect. But this is a start, and it's really setting the stage for the next, as I said, how Vermont engages on addressing climate change for the next 30 years. So I am going to stop right there and come back to actual faces. And I am going to pass it on to Lauren.
Thank you, Steve. And thanks everyone for being here. When Rachel asked me to join an 8 p.m. webinar, I will say that I was a little confused by the timing. And now that I'm here, I'm happy to say that with it being at 8 p.m., I was able to squeeze in a run and even get some food in. So I hope all of you were able to get some outdoor time between work, some fresh air. It's a really beautiful day out there. As Rachel said, my name is Lauren Oates. I'm the Climate and Energy Policy Manager with the Nature Conservancy in Vermont. The Nature Conservancy's mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends in order to create a world where both people and nature thrive. So it's no surprise that climate change stands at direct odds and challenges that mission, and a mission that is shared at least in some ways with many other organizations like the Sierra Club on the line today. So as we consider climate change being a global issue, we're really focusing on Vermont, and Vermont is a special place for a lot of reasons, but in the past couple of decades, we've actually shown ourselves to be the greatest per capita emitter in the region, and the region is New England, New York, and Quebec. We have the greatest vehicle miles traveled because we're a rural state, so we have a huge amount of emissions coming out of our transportation sector. We set goals, like Steve said, way back in the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006, and we've continued to miss those goals, and we've continued to increase our emissions, even though those goals aim to decrease our emissions from our 1990 baseline levels. So we're going in the wrong direction, and though we're a small state, we're still complicit in this, and we still need to right our wrongs, and we need to be a player and catch up to the rest of the states in our region and countries across the globe. And I know Jenny will be covering a couple of the specifics of this law and how other states in the region have already started implementing them and are seeing successes. So I won't get into that, but I'll just say we're late to the table here, and it's time to catch up and be the green state that we like to consider ourselves to be. So instead of having goals that we continue to miss, the Global Warming Solutions Act intends to change those over to requirements, like Steve said, and we have specific targets that we have to meet. And Jenny will talk about what that looks like if we don't meet them. But having that regulatory and accountability framework is going to be absolutely critical for us to play a role in reducing our emissions. And beyond the reducing our emissions, there's good news. It's not just about reducing our emissions. So within the Nature Conservancy, as we consider how to tackle climate change, we consider basically 3 pillars. There's the obvious, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, which is absolutely necessary and critical, and we don't have much time to do it, so we need to move quickly. But there's also the need to remove the carbon that is already in the air, because there's so much excess carbon in the air. And nature and our working lands can play a huge role in that. Estimates are somewhere between 30 and 40% based on where you are in the world. So that is an extremely significant number, between a fifth and a third of what we need to remove from the atmosphere. We can use our natural systems, our wetlands, our forests, our soil can store a vast amount of our carbon. So we've got reducing emissions through a transition to a clean energy economy. We've got removing emissions through our natural and working lands. And we also have adapting. And that's something that I'm especially excited to see is captured within the Global Warming Solutions Act, because it's not enough to just start tackling climate change through mitigating measures. We also need to be adapting to what's already changing on the ground. It comes as no surprise to many of you on the call that we're seeing increasing frequency and storm severity and the amount of water that we're receiving. We had a 3-fold increase in our presidential disaster declarations in the 2010s versus the 2000s. So just in that 1 decade shift, we had a 3-fold increase. And there's real opportunity in adapting. There is an opportunity to reduce our future costs. In fact, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, estimates that we can save or we can avoid about $7 in future costs by implementing $1 worth of adaptive measures now. So there's a real economic opportunity here. And I think the Global Warming Solutions Act does a really good job of not only laying out the issues ahead and how we are going to address those, but the economic opportunity for our beautiful state. So we've got a beautiful natural and working landscape, a really healthy recreation economy and tourism economy, maybe not in the year 2020, but in past years and in years ahead, obviously. And so we need to be leveraging those to protect our rural communities, to build in rural resilience. And you'll have seen through Steve's presentation that many of the subcommittees that Climate Action Council is going to stand up address those specifically. So this is a really, really comprehensive bill. We're excited. Even though we're late to the game, we were able to cherry pick some of the best from across the region and country and make sure that we're addressing climate change in a really comprehensive way that also supports our rural economy and recognizes the real economic opportunities that come with shifting to a green economy. So, yep, I wanted to be brief because I was told that this is a really active group who has a lot of questions, and I can actually see some questions coming in on the chat now. So I want to yield the rest of my time, but I'll just say the Nature Conservancy in Vermont is really excited to be supportive of the Global Warming Solutions Act, is really, really excited to see the focus on our natural and working lands and leveraging the role that nature can play in reducing and removing our carbon emissions and recognizing the need to adapt to an already changing climate. So happy to be here, happy to answer questions. I think I'm passing over to Jenny now.
Yes, thank you, Lauren. Hi, everybody. I'm Jenny Rushlow. As Rachel said, I'm the director of the Environmental Law Center at Vermont Law School. And just to give a little more background, before I came to Vermont Law School, I was practicing law, working at Conservation Law Foundation, based out of Massachusetts. And I worked in the Clean Energy and Climate Change program. I did some other things there too. But relevant to this conversation, I was involved in litigation to enforce the Massachusetts Global Warming Solutions Act. And my organization was also involved in advocacy that led to the adoption of a statute that was the second climate change law, the second Global Warming Solutions Act law in the country. So now coming to Vermont, I've been part of some efforts, testified before the committees that are looking at the bill that has made it so far in the legislature in Vermont, and have mostly brought to bear the knowledge that I have from what we went through in Massachusetts. And so today, what I thought I would do is put what's happening in Vermont a bit more into regional perspective, and highlight in particular why it's important to have accountability measures built into climate statutes based on what we experienced in Massachusetts and what we've seen in other states. So to put this into the regional perspective, all of the New England states have reduction targets, the climate laws with greenhouse gas emission reduction targets that are in statute. And Vermont has a plan, but as Lauren said, it hasn't been enough. It hasn't been enough to keep us from backsliding. And though the other states have climate laws, and it's very important that those climate reduction requirements are in statute, are actually law, and that there's at least theoretically some accountability just by it being in the law. The only state in the region that I'm aware of, and possibly the only in the country last I checked, that had an enforcement mechanism built into the statute is Massachusetts. And so it's great to see that Vermont, and as Lauren said, is late to the table, but the upside of that is it's had the opportunity to learn from the experience of other states. And so one of the things that has meant is including language in the bill that would allow for enforcement, specifically litigation, to enforce the requirements of the law to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that it doesn't adopt exactly what the Massachusetts law did. In fact, it goes farther than that and learns from not just what the law in Massachusetts said, but the litigation that came subsequent to it, and then uses better language than what was contemplated in Massachusetts. So that shows that Vermont, has been paying close attention to how to make this bill as good as it can be. So that's great to see. And then it also includes some provisions from other states that have gone through this process. It includes a stakeholder council, which is a policy approach that was, they emulated a policy in Maine, in the Maine state climate change law. And I think there are other pieces borrowed from New York and other states, which I commend them for. It's great to see that they took the time to really study what other states had done, and coming in late to not just start where Massachusetts was 12 years ago when they passed their climate law, but to look at where we are now and to pass a law that reflects where we are now. So that's great to see. On the enforcement front, I'll talk a little bit about what happened in Massachusetts, and then give some thoughts on what it might look like in Vermont. So in Massachusetts, I'm just pulling up my slides for myself. You can't see them, but just so that I have my notes in front of me. The Global Warming Solutions Act in Massachusetts was made law in 2008, and it was the second climate change law in the country. The first one was in California, also called the Global Warming Solutions Act, or AB 32 was the name of the law. and that was passed in 2006. And the 2008 law in Massachusetts, one important thing to know about it was that it wasn't just passed on its own. It was passed as a kind of in tandem with some other relevant environmental laws. The same year, Massachusetts also passed the Green Communities Act. And some people would say that it's really important to look at that suite of policies because greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets on their own may not account for all of the related issues, land use issues and economic challenges that might need to be addressed as related to climate change through other kinds of policy mechanisms. And the Massachusetts law required a reduction of 25% below 1990 levels greenhouse gas emissions by 2020 and an 80% reduction by 2050.
A lot of what these laws tend to include is tracking what emissions look like, what they would look like if business as usual proceeded, what it would look like with applied emissions reductions targets, and registries to keep track of everybody who's emitting greenhouse gas emissions, and requirements for plans for how you're going to get there. And then those plans are done typically by an agency at their own discretion. And that's kind of where the meat of the reductions happens, is where the agency who's interpreting this statute that's been passed by the legislature, that's where the action happens, is at the agency level, who then tells individual polluters what it is they'll need to do to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And in Massachusetts, there was a particular item in the statute that really led to all of the enforcement action, and that was language that said that the DEP was required to promulgate regulations implementing the climate change law. And the exact language, I'll read to you if you're interested, but if it sounds confusing, that's probably why it led to lots of litigation. It says, the department shall promulgate regulations establishing a desired level of declining annual aggregate emission limits for sources or categories of sources that emit greenhouse gas emissions. So we spent years arguing about what that means. And that's what I mean when I say it's great that Vermont has had the opportunity to learn from what's happened in other states and maybe improve the drafting of the law. What that language required, that taken together with other portions of the law, was that they were required to put into place regulations that would ratchet down greenhouse gas emissions year by year for different sources or sectors of the economy. And DEP, while that was the position that advocates took, that was not the interpretation of the law that the state had, that DEP had. And so the statute required DEP to have promulgated these regulations by January 1st, 2012. And advocates met with the state over a period of a couple of years in the hope of reaching some agreement about what kind of regulations were contemplated when that statute was passed. And I was at Conservation Law Foundation at the time. And there was really just an impasse in terms of what the advocates thought the law meant and what the state thought the law meant. And so, conversational advocacy did not yield results. And so we and some other plaintiffs sued DEP in 2014. And our lawsuit was pretty simple. It said the agency was required to promulgate regulations implementing the statute, and they didn't do it. They didn't do it by the deadline, and you, court, need to tell them that they have to do it. And that litigation went all the way up to the Supreme Court in Massachusetts, where we were successful. And the Supreme Court told the state that that language requiring the regulations was clear and unambiguous, and they required a specific type of regulations that would actually ratchet down emissions year by year. And I'm sort of glossing over the details of what those regulations needed to look like, what style of regulations they needed to be. And And so as a result of that, the state promulgated 6 sets of regulations that are designed to meet that language in the Mass GWSA. And there was then subsequent litigation where the industry then sued the state. And so to Steve's point, you know, there is risk of litigation from both sides, and the state won that lawsuit. And so the industry lost, and the state's been able to move forward with implementing those regulations pursuant to the GWSA. There was no provision in the Massachusetts state law that allowed for citizen enforcement. We relied on other sources of standing, as we call it in legal speak, to allow us to bring that lawsuit. I'm really glad to see that the Vermont law sets a clear pathway for what enforcement will look like. The Vermont law provides very clear guidance about what the agency is required to do, what the role of the stakeholder council is, and what happens if the greenhouse gas emissions targets aren't met, or what happens if the agency actions, the regulations that have to be promulgated, what happens if those actions aren't taken? And very clearly lays out what the legal pathway would be and who has the right to challenge that. Which I think is really smart, because it makes it clear to everyone what they can expect in terms of enforcement. And that provides assurances for business. It gives the government a clear directive. And, you know, in Massachusetts, people ask me all the time why DEP didn't do the regulations to begin with. And I can't answer that. I assume it's because it's a challenging task to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide, and a task that would be unpopular with certain sectors of industry. But I think in light of all of that, I think Vermont's really smart to include the enforcement provisions that it does. So I'm happy to talk more about that. The one other thing I just want to talk about before we open it up to questions is a bit about the racial justice impacts here. California was the first state to have a Global Warming Solutions Act, and so kind of the opposite of Vermont, they were the first to go, and so they got to walk into all of the mistakes that the first person inevitably makes. And one of the criticisms that the law got in California, that I think is just something that those states that are adopting laws like this now should be aware of, is their law included a cap and trade provision, you know, creating a market for emissions allowances. And the way that works, and we have a regional program like this here in New England that I'm happy to talk about more if there are questions about how that relates to the state climate laws. But the cap and trade system allows polluters to emit to a certain point, and if they emit below their limit, they can sell some of their allowances and make money off it. And if you're a company that's polluting too much, then you buy allowances from a company that didn't use all of theirs. And so the idea is that it caps emissions for a particular jurisdiction, a particular set of pollutants. And that's for greenhouse gas emissions specifically. That cap and trade system, because this was a climate law focused on GHGs, it didn't apply to other pollutants, or what you might call co-pollutants, like particulate matter or sulfur dioxide, other types of pollution that have health impacts that aren't greenhouse gas emissions. There are other types of pollution. In California, after the climate law was passed, there was actually documented evidence that some of the worst polluters that reduced their greenhouse gas emissions after the passage of the climate change law there actually increased the emission of other toxic pollutants. And so it was in response to that criticism from environmental justice organizations that California, 10 years later, passed another climate change bill that increased the amount of money that comes in through fees from the cap and trade program, increase the amount of money from that goes to low-income communities. And that money is intended to be spent on things like energy efficiency and affordable housing, low carbon transportation and public transit. And certainly that's, I think, something that states passing climate change laws now should be aware of. The criticism to then that second climate change bill was that it provided those fees and distributed them on the basis of income, when in fact race is the clear determinant of pollution, disproportionate exposure to pollution, much more so than income. So that was an additional criticism of that law. California, I think, California is very different from Vermont in that it has, much more representation of people of color in the legislature and powerful environmental justice organizations with sway in the legislature. And so it's impressive that California was able to pass a second law and make steps forward. I know the California Air Resources Board has a whole staff person dedicated specifically to environmental justice and their Global Warming Solutions Act. But I think the lesson there is that cap and trade programs, while I'm not saying cap and trade programs are bad, they accomplish a lot. But they tend to be popular for programs like this because they're the least cost measure. And just because it's the least cost measure doesn't mean that we'll appropriately account for social and human health impacts. And I think the Vermont law is awesome and fully support its passage and implementation. But I just mentioned these items as something to be aware of and that I hope stakeholders will pay attention to as hopefully the law is passed and we move on to implementation.
So let's take, I know we're a little short on time. So Steve, can you take 2 minutes to maybe identify, were there any final comments about opportunities that you see in the bill? And then I do want to call attention, I'll read some questions and answers in the chat and then we'll turn to Jack.
Yeah, I think I just sum it, I sort of shrink it down to the idea that, we talk a lot about, some of us talk a lot about how this climate change and transitioning to a green energy economy represents as much of an opportunity as it does a cost. So I think that this, with its diverse approach, it's not just about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it's about building, the whole idea of just transition is transitioning to an equitable and powerful new economy. So there's the idea of regenerative agriculture is built into this. The idea, and I think of it as kind of a regenerative, we rebuild regenerative communities as we create dense downtowns that support good regional transportation initiatives, regenerative energy economy, all these ideas that where you can, one system is kind of a win-lose system. This can be a win-win kind of a system, and hopefully, as we look at this transition over many years, that's a great opportunity. I think I'll just leave it at that because
So let me, before we turn to Jack, I just so a couple questions. Gina in the chat asked what the timetable for the plan is to be developed and the recommendations implemented over time, and Steve replied in the chat that the plan is by the end of 2021, rules a year after that. I think he's referring to the climate action plan by 2021, the rules a year after that. It's fast by bureaucratic standards, but slow relative to the need for action on climate change. Someone else in the chat asked about, Gina also asked, so being a veteran of past energy and climate plans, that seems like a fast timeline. The convening, analysis, drafting, et cetera, takes resources the agencies don't have. Where does the funding come from? Not for the recommendations, but for undertaking the planning. And the response in the chat was that the House version includes funding for 3 staff, plus consulting for a year, then just the staff for the second year, but the process goes on for 3 decades. This is all in the air now, with the budget being refigured and is a key advocacy point at the moment. There's also some other information about the other bills. One other thing I wanted to mention for turning to Jack is that we have Representative Jim Maslin, who's here on the Zoom. And maybe if after Jack asks his question, if he wants to jump in with any comments from his perspective as a legislator, we'd love to have your perspective. Jack?
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks to Lauren and Jenny and Steve. As always, a very laden conversation here. I'm going to try to explore a little more deeply the issue of the just transitions. I'm just going to post into the chat a little bit of text from the bill itself in case you want to see what specifically it says about a just transition. This is so important because, not just because just transition is the right thing to do, but you can't succeed without a just transition. There would be too much rightful opposition to anything that might be considered an unjust transition. And the just transition contemplates two different things. One is to lessen the disproportionate impact of climate change on marginalized communities and the vulnerable. And the other is to make sure that the cure, the medicine that's being prescribed is accessible to everybody. And so those are kind of two different aspects of the just transition. Now, my question for our experts is this. There's going to be this process, there's going to be this council. How do we as activists build our way into that discussion? How do we make sure that from the get-go, the just transition is recognized? And how do we protect the interests of those who aren't well positioned to protect their own interests? What is it that we need to do as climate activists to ensure that this vital part of the bill is proved out? Does anyone have thoughts about that?
This is Jenny. I have a few thoughts. I mean, my sense, being relatively new to Vermont and having been involved in environmental justice in Massachusetts, is that Vermont is still kind of figuring out what environmental justice means here as a largely white state with different equity challenges than many of the other states that people think of as, I mean, certainly very different from California. And I talked about how that played out there. And so I think it could happen in the context of this council, or it could happen outside of that. But the agencies that are going to be involved need some real education and need to do some real internal work to figure out what environmental justice looks like in Vermont before attempting to solve that through the work of the climate law. And so I think this presents a great opportunity for the state government to try and figure that out. But I guess what I'm trying to say is there's some real groundwork that needs to be laid. And I know there are some organizations working on that right now. And VLS has been involved in that too. So I think that just jumping in with stakeholders present at the council is probably not going to get us all the way there. It's a bigger effort than that.
Well, one of my concerns would be that this council is made up of designated advocates for various sectors of society, some of which are more powerful than others. And it seems to me that the formation of this subcommittee and the assignments to the subcommittee and the transparency of the subcommittee's work, since it's going to be adopting a measurement tool to assess this equitability, this is part of the crux of the enforcement of the law. And it seems to me that there needs to be a lot of attention paid as to that inside baseball kind of process. Otherwise, we'll end up talking about it. You can talk a good talk, as in the Essex plan, and then nothing ever comes of it.
So Sue Kaplan actually had a question in the chat about what is the makeup of the council, who decides who's on the council, and then what kind of diversity is there in the group? I wonder, can someone take that question? Maybe just to help us learn more about that.
I could address that briefly. I posted a link to the law itself as passed by the House, the version that was passed, which is essentially the final version. There's a slight addition from the Senate, which actually does include a seat on the council from the manufacturing sector. But there are some agency heads, and then there are, I think, 15 or 16 different seats allocated to various business sectors, the fuels sector, a couple of seats for environmental type representatives, a youth representative. So take a look. I mean, it's a long list, and I don't have it in my head, but it is still a specified list. And I think to get at some of what Jenny was just talking about, I think the answer there is it's really, really hard to effectively engage people in this. And I think that we are talking about a significant transition. I don't think very many people recognize the changes that are coming to us. It's like, 10 months ago saying, would a pandemic change Vermont's social structure very much? And you would say, well, of course not. We've got all the resources to deal with that. But the changes coming from climate change are likely to be just as dramatic as this. May happen over a longer period of time, but it is going to take some deep digging in ourselves to figure out, what are the systems that put it in place now, to put us in this place now, where some people have the resources and can respond effectively, and other people don't have the resources and yet are bearing the biggest impacts. So how do we get here? And then what are the structures that build us out of that? And it's a long discussion, but I would just throw out one example. As we develop this green energy economy, I think in some ways we're talking about, solar panels and local economy. And in many ways, as I think through that, I think there's to some degree, it's a shift towards an emphasis from, larger companies controlling things to smaller businesses, to even to say blue collar type businesses. And if you think about the kinds of social supports that are present in our society, we have the strongest social supports for the white collar, for the more educated, for larger organizations and businesses. And to transition to that diverse kind of on the ground green economy, to me, one of the huge things is providing the social supports that make that kind of working class stronger. And so I go to things like healthcare. I go to things like education for your kids. I go to things like, how do you plan for your retirement? All those kinds of things are benefits that go to people in those, the white collar world, the bigger industry world. But if we're looking at the diverse, dispersed, well-distributed green energy economy, I think when you look at something like the Green New Deal, the national Green New Deal, that's got those things built in. It's not just because they're good ideas. It's because they are essential in making this green economy function. And those
so
are
Steve,
also essential in supporting, as Jack was saying, the people who are the least supported in our state.
I think that's a really important message. I want to turn to Lauren. Did you want to add to the discussion?
And I'll be very brief because I want to make sure that we get to other questions too. But to Jack's point, and to harken back to something Steve said at the very beginning, not only is there a Just Transition subcommittee, but there's also a Rural Resilience subcommittee that I think, though not called Address Transitions, really does call into part of its core this equity piece. And as we consider marginalized communities and impacts both globally to climate change, Vermont is obviously, we experience our own. We have 12% of mobile homes located within mobile home parks are in the floodplain versus only 4% of single family homes, as just a quick example of people with fewer resources being put into more hazardous locations. I also want to, so there are two different committees I think that can address this. And I also, recognizing Gina's point, that her question earlier, I'm a recently, was a recent state employee, and I was responsible for a really large state planning effort. So I know how long those can take, and I know how resource intensive they can be, but I also recognize the opportunity for involvement and broad stakeholder engagement. So while the Climate Action Council calls specific entities in, those subcommittees don't. So the subcommittees don't say who needs to be at the table. And I think making sure that whether we're individual activists or whether we represent advocate organizations, we can push to either be at those tables to make sure those voices are heard and those thoughts are captured, but that we also recognize that we as subject matter experts can lend a hand even if we're not at the table. So making sure that we're part of that conversation, I don't think will be unnecessarily challenging, but I think we need to continue to speak up and be heard.
That's a great point. I also want to shout out, Jenny was referring to a project called the Rejoice Project, and we actually had the Rejoice team on a community conversation. So if you want to watch that recording and learn about what they're doing to help kind of educate the state about environmental justice and also get community information and engagement into the general process for that in the state, you can check out that recording. I also want to welcome Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman, who has joined the chat. So thank you for joining. So we've got a lot of questions in the chat. So this is obviously a very robust group. We've got here, Alan is wondering, he wants to know how many people think we should be pushing for greater reductions and faster. And I wonder if people want to put like a thumbs up on their chat if they agree with that. It does seem like we need to move quickly. Alan also says, I can't help but think that any of us with grandchildren will be judging us a little too. Gina's also mentioning in the chat, having the right people there is important, but what's more important is the manner of engagement and a process that will produce recommendations that achieve the stated goals, a very heavy lift. Richard also points out that I think we have to accelerate. Tipping points are occurring across the planet and aren't waiting for us to act. Critical is getting rid of Trump and his cadre and pushing Biden hard. Looks like there's a lot more comments. Does anyone want to ask a question or jump in? I know Representative Maslin's here too. You could raise your hand and then I could give you the floor if someone wants to jump in.
There's Jim.
Yep, Jim, did you want to jump in?
Just a couple of brief comments, not to repeat all the good stuff that everybody's saying, but I was just reading Gina Campoli's chat. Having the right people there is important, but what's more important is the manner of engagement. And I'd also say what happens outside the committee is just as important. I mean, there's something to do every day, all day, and being present in what we're talking about and cognizant of our actions day to day, or what we speak or how we speak to people is as much important in toto as the people on the committee, I think. It wouldn't appear that at the outset, but if you know someone's on the committee or you find a way to engage with them, and feet to the fire is a phrase that's getting overused here, but just be cognizant about everything that happens and how it all is going to fit together. It's sort of leading from the middle, I guess you could say, more than necessarily at the head. There are plenty of people who want to be at the head, but the rest of us need to be the middle benchers that make things really happen, you know. So thank you.
Gina, did you want to jump in? You had some questions and comments. Did we cover everything that's on your mind, or did you want to share some thoughts?
No, I think things are being answered. Yeah, I had some other ideas, but I'll raise them later.
For those that are interested, we also we are going to stay on a little after the recording ends at 9. So if you have other questions and maybe don't want to ask during the recording, you can do that. Alan, did you want to jump in with some of your comments? Steve, did you have a comment?
Yeah. I just want to, actually, this replies to something Alan said about an urgency, and a lot of people raised put the little thumbs up there. There's no way we will meet the 2025 targets relying on the Global Warming Solutions Act, because that won't even have its rules out for a couple of years. So it's really critical, and we're not on track. We started to drop our carbon emissions at the last count, but we're still far from being on track. But we could be, and it's going to take a massive effort. So, one of the things we'd like to see the legislature get onto very quickly is how to crank up the mechanisms that are already in place. There's one bill that's a great idea, which is expanding the scope of the efficiency utility. And that's I don't know if it'll pass this session, but it's been making good progress. But it isn't really funded. It's just moving funds around. We could do this through efficiency alone. We could meet our first targets, and that's probably the quickest way to do it. The Green New Deal legislation that Senator Polina introduced, it has a funding mechanism that leaves the lower income folks out of the picture of funding and taps the people that got a huge tax break from the Trump administration to fund, it's to the tune of $30 million, but which is to drop in the bucket, but it's a good start. And between those two things, I think that we would be doing, there are opportunities out there that would also build our new green economy. So I don't think it's going to happen easily. We're not in easy times to say we need money in this particular situation, but maybe there are ways for COVID response and climate response to go hand in hand.
So Beth Sachs in the chat has said that she agrees with Alan and thinks that we need to do this by mandate as quickly and aggressively as we can. Beth, did you have any questions for the panel or anything you wanted to share? Other questions from the audience for our expert panel here? Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman, did you want to jump in? Do you have any perspectives on the bill?
There we go. Now I can unmute briefly with my space bar. Well, I got in a little bit late. I assume you're talking about the Global Warming Solutions Act.
Yep.
And, I think it's a critical piece of legislation because it finally sets real benchmarks. But I completely agree that there's a lot more that we need to do. And as I noted in the chat column, because I didn't know if I'd have the opportunity to speak and don't want to take up too many folks' time if others want to speak, that the climate crisis is one of the reasons I jumped in this race. Most people said, well, you should wait 2 more years. It'll be easier to beat the governor or take an open seat in 2 years. But we don't have 2 years to wait with respect to the climate crisis. And I've been speaking about the Green New Deal the same way that Anthony's introduced a bill. I would go a lot farther. I would say about half of the top 5% Trump tax cuts, so more like $100 million a year, as opposed to I think his bill is around 30 or 40 million. And really work on building efficient, affordable housing in village centers, expand broadband across the state to cut down our commuting mileage, which has been one of the highest per capita in the country. Work on really investing in weatherizing seniors' homes who are on fixed income so they can stay in place and age in place, which is healthier for them, and reduce their energy bills, which is really tough on folks on fixed income, as well as weatherizing working class people's homes, folks that are living on $12, $13, $14 an hour, who don't have the money up front to weatherize their homes, but who, if we weatherize their homes, they can also afford to stay in place and be better off economically. So take a progressive economic outlook on some of these issues as well. And, keep looking at every aspect we can, just as I do on the farm, looking for efficiencies all the time, because the climate crisis and economic justice can actually be very much hand in hand. And certainly working with all of you and legislators like Jim and others to help lead the way is going to be far more possible with a Zuckerman administration than with a Phil Scott administration. We can do it with 77 and 80 votes and not have to get to 100 votes to override the governor every time. So thank you for the chance to chat.
Sure. And we've got some more comments rolling in. Dan says that any meetings of these subcommittees need to be attended in great numbers by the public. We cannot allow delay. Sue, do you want to jump in with your question or comment? I can also read your comment.
I guess I could read it as well. Thanks, Rachel. So one of the things, communications and stakeholder engagement are really important. And one of the things that that will help is if you can get the healthcare industry, the providers, the hospitals, to work with the climate advocates and environmental justice advocates. If there's a clear message, I think you can bring municipalities, businesses, nonprofits, and residents together to move faster and to get not only get the legislation passed and signed, but also be effective.
Christine has a great question, and it seems a lot of people are interested in the council. Christine, do you want to ask your question, or I can also read it?
You can ask it, but I know that the group that was organizing the payment for ecological services, that committee was very accessible. All of their meetings were posted. You could sign up for information about what they were doing each month. And I hope that this will be true of the council that's going to, and I'm wondering when it will start and if there will be public testimony.
I could respond briefly to say that
Anybody know anything about that?
Yeah, it looks like Lauren has some. Well, we've got two. Lauren, do you want to respond to Sue's question quickly before we?
I just popped in a quick link for her that I think she might think is interesting, that the Vermont Department of Health, who actually had one of the most impressive testimonies, which is, I guess, a bit biased, when they were testifying before the House Energy and Technology Committee on this bill, that tied together really perfectly public health impacts of climate change and public health opportunities, but also the cost of those, which is incredibly high. So as we continue to consider climate change, economic opportunities and impacts, that public health component is so critical, and it's, you know, at the heart or keystone of it all. So I would check out the website. They've got a lot of really great infographics and information.
Thanks, Lauren.
You're welcome.
Steve, do you want to take Christine's question?
Well, a couple of things about the council and access. For one thing, once the bill is passed, the language calls for naming the people on the council within 60 days. Then it is the Secretary of Administration, obviously who works directly for the governor, who calls the meetings. And they are also required to hold a number of hearings. It's not a specific number of hearings, but it is in diverse and most, I think it calls for holding some of the hearings in places where people are most affected or have difficulty getting to hearings. But I think the point has been made here and earlier that that it really to get at folks. One of the reasons that people who are underserved is because they're just too busy, and they're just busy making their lives work to engage in public discussions. And so how do you get to those folks? I think that it's going to take more than even just a handful of hearings around the state. To really and to frame this transition in the right way, I think that has to happen. I don't really have a good answer for that. I hope that the nonprofit world steps up and finds ways to help make that happen, and that the Climate Council will, and the leadership of it, particularly the governor has a big role in this, whoever that is. And it's going to be a lot of different people over the next 30 years. Hopefully they will take that input in and take that really seriously. But 60 days to see who's on the council, and then it's up to I should say one of the Senate amendments is to allow 50% of the council to call for a meeting if they aren't being held by the chair.
So we're bumping up against our time. Lauren or Jenny, did you have any final remarks before we turn the recording off? And then we can stick around if there's any questions people want to ask offline.
No, thank you. I'll just say, from a legal standpoint, if anyone ever wants to chat, I'm here. And thanks so much for all of your interest in the bill and this issue. It's so important to have everyone engaged.
Lauren?
Thanks everyone for staying late. I'll stay on too so I can answer any more questions or have a few more thoughts to share too.
Rob put an important comment that we'll just mention before we turn the recording off. Then you can ask your burning questions. If you haven't contacted your legislator, please do, and thank them for their vote and give them the courage to forge forward on getting it to the governor's desk and signed. So with that, we'll turn the recording off. And then if folks want to stick around, we'll hang out for a little bit and you can ask your questions. Thank you so much for participating tonight and spending your evening with us.